Good morning. Welcome to today's story, a touching, humane, and educational tale.
They laughed when a 16-year-old girl bought a forgotten storm shelter on a frozen hill. But before winter was over, that rusted steel door would become the only thing standing between half the town and the cold. This story is about resilience, dignity, and the quiet truth that the places people dismiss are sometimes the very places where hope begins again. By the time Maeve Collins carried her second-hand suitcase up the hill, the wind had already turned sharp enough to sting her cheeks. Below her, the town of Briar Glen sat in the fading gold of late autumn. All church steeples, pickup trucks, and thin trails of chimney smoke beginning to rise into the evening sky. It looked peaceful from a distance. Up close, it had never felt that way to her. Not since her mother died in the spring. Not since Maeve had been passed into her uncle's house like an old piece of furniture no one wanted, but no one could quite throw away. She was 16. Too young, according to everyone in town, to be on her own. Old enough, according to life, to understand when she was no longer welcome. The shelter stood at the edge of the woods, half buried into the hillside, squat and gray beneath a crust of dead vines and years of neglect. It had once been built as a storm refuge long before Maeve was born, back when winters in these mountains were feared the way people feared war stories and floodwater. Now it was just a relic, a joke, a forgotten block of concrete and steel the town had sold off for almost nothing because nobody wanted the trouble of tearing it down. Maeve had bought it with every dollar she had left, $28 in cash, a folded receipt, and a kind of stubbornness that had already carried her farther than comfort ever had. Her boots scraped over gravel as she climbed the final few steps to the steel door. Rust streaked down its hinges like old tears. The handle was cold enough to numb her fingers through the glove with the missing thumb. She paused there for a moment, not because she was scared of the dark inside, not because she thought she had made a mistake, but because this was the first thing she had ever owned that no one could take back with one angry sentence. Below the hill, someone shouted something she couldn't quite hear, followed by a burst of laughter. Probably boys from town, probably the same ones who had watched from a pickup when she signed the paper that morning at the county office. One of them had said, loud enough for her to hear, "That girl bought herself a tomb." Maeve remembered that. She remembered a lot of things. The sound of cupboards slamming in her uncle's kitchen, the way people lowered their voices when talking about her, as if grief had made her fragile instead of tired. The humiliating kindness in their faces when they said words like, "poor thing." She had no use for pity anymore. What she wanted was a door that closed, a roof that held, a place where she could leave a cup on a table and find it there the next morning. She tightened her hand around the handle and pulled. The steel door groaned open with a deep, scraping cry that echoed into the hill. A breath of stale air rolled out at her, cold, earthy, metallic, carrying dust, old concrete, and the ghost of long-dead winters. Maeve lifted her flashlight and stepped inside. The beam swept across narrow stairs, cracked walls, rusted shelves, a broken cot frame, and a line of old hooks bolted into the concrete. Everything was coated in neglect. Everything looked abandoned, and yet, the place did not feel dead. It felt waiting. She moved down one careful step at a time, her breathing soft in the stillness. The shelter was colder than the air outside, but steadier somehow, as if the earth itself had wrapped around it and held its silence for decades. At the bottom of the stairs, Maeve stopped. Her flashlight landed on an old vent wheel fixed into the wall, then on a stack of dented supply tins, then on a faded wool blanket folded in the corner like someone had meant to come back for it and never did. Outside, the wind hissed through the dry grass. Inside, Maeve stood alone in the dust and dim light, her heart pounding not with fear, but with something far more dangerous. Hope. For the first time in a very long while, the cold around her did not feel like a warning. It felt like a beginning. The next morning, Maeve woke before sunrise with the cold pressed deep into her bones. For a few seconds, she did not remember where she was. Then she saw the low concrete ceiling above her, the narrow beam of gray dawn slipping through the half-clacked vent, the old wool blanket she had wrapped around herself during the night, and the metal door at the top of the stairs. The shelter, her shelter. She sat up slowly on the pile of coats and blankets she had made into a bed, rubbing warmth back into her hands. Her flashlight lay beside her. So did the folded county receipt with her name on it, slightly creased now from being checked 3 times before sleep, as if she still needed proof this place was real. Outside, the wind had quieted. Inside, the silence felt different than it had the night before. Less haunted, more honest. Maeve climbed the stairs, pushed open the steel door, and stepped into a pale, brittle morning. Frost silvered the weeds around the entrance. The trees at the edge of the woods stood still and dark against the sky. Down in Briar Glen, smoke rose from chimneys in thin blue threads, and somewhere far off she could hear the low rumble of a pickup starting up for the day. The town was waking, and whether anybody believed it or not, so was she. She spent that morning doing what people do when they have no choice but to begin. She worked. She dragged broken boards and rusted cans out of the main room and stacked them by the hill. She shook dust out of old blankets until her throat burned. She swept the floor with a cracked push broom she found behind the stairs. Every motion sent little clouds of gray into the flashlight beams and morning light. By noon, her shoulders ached. By 1 o'clock, her fingers were scraped raw. By mid-afternoon, the place still looked rough, but no longer abandoned. That mattered. A place did not become home all at once. Sometimes it became home one swept corner at a time. Near the back wall, behind a collapsed storage rack, Maeve found a narrow door she had not noticed the night before. It stuck hard in the frame. She braced one boot against the concrete and pulled with both hands until it gave with a hard, rusty pop. Inside was a smaller room. Cooler, darker, and better preserved. There were old metal shelves bolted to the walls, a workbench, 2 dented water jugs, and a wooden crate half split at the corners. On top of it sat a thick layer of dust, but beneath that dust was order. Whoever had once used this shelter had not lived carelessly. Maeve crouched beside the crate and opened it. Inside, she found 3 things that made her stop breathing for a second. A bundle of yellowed papers tied with twine, a small hand tool kit wrapped in oilcloth, and a black ledger book with a cracked spine. She lifted the ledger carefully, almost reverently, and opened it near the front. The handwriting inside was neat, slanted, and old-fashioned. Not fancy, just careful. There were pages of inventory lists, canned beans, lamp oil, blankets, iodine, kindling, then diagrams, vent shafts, water lines, heat flow notes, storage rotation. One page had a hand-drawn sketch of the shelter with arrows showing how to keep warmth from escaping too fast in a blizzard. Another listed instructions for sealing side vents if snow piled too high against the hillside. Maeve read every word twice, not because she understood it all yet, but because something in those pages felt steady, practical, wise, the kind of knowledge built by someone who had survived hard seasons and expected others might need to do the same. She was still kneeling there when she heard footsteps outside. Not quick footsteps, older ones, slower, measured. Maeve stood immediately, the ledger clutched in one hand. A shadow crossed the entrance. Then a woman's voice, calm and dry as kindling, drifted down the stairwell. You planning to greet visitors with that wrench? Or is that just your natural hospitality? Maeve looked down and realized she had picked up a heavy pipe wrench without thinking. At the top of the stairs stood Iris Bell. She wore a long quilted coat, sensible boots, and a knitted scarf wrapped twice around her neck. In one hand, she carried a paper grocery bag. In the other, a thermos. Maeve lowered the wrench, embarrassed. I wasn't sure who it was. That, Iris said, stepping down carefully, is usually a sign your instincts are working. She looked around that shelter, taking in the swept floor, the sorted piles, the open back room. Then she gave the faintest nod. Well now, she said, you've already done more for this place in one morning than this town has done in 20 years. Maeve did not know what to say to that. Iris handed her the grocery bag. Inside was a loaf of sandwich bread, a jar of peanut butter, 2 apples, a box of matches, and a small packet of soup mix. The thermos smelled like chicken broth. Maeve swallowed hard. You don't have to. I know, Iris said. That's why I brought it. For a moment, Maeve could only stand there holding the bag. People in town had given her looks, warnings, pity. This was different. This felt like respect. Iris's eyes moved to the ledger in Maeve's hand. Found Harold Mercer's book, did you? Maeve blinked. You know who this belonged to? I know who built half the repairs in this shelter, Iris said. And I know that man trusted systems more than luck. During the winter of '78, people stayed alive in here because Harold knew how air moved, how heat was held, and how panic could ruin a room faster than cold. Maeve looked back down at the pages. The notes no longer felt random. They felt like inheritance, not of money, not of comfort, but of survival. Iris set the thermos on the workbench and rested one gloved hand on the shelf beside her. If you're going to stay here, girl, she said quietly, then don't just clean it. Learn it. Maeve looked around the shelter again. At the vents, the shelves, the hidden room, the old book in her hands. And for the first time, the place seemed to shift before her eyes. It was no longer just a roof and four walls. It was a machine, a memory, a test, and maybe if she was strong and patient enough, a teacher. By the end of that week, Maeve stopped thinking of the shelter as something she had bought and started thinking of it as something she had to earn. The difference mattered. Anybody could unlock a door, but keeping cold out, keeping fear down, keeping a place alive through the first hard edge of winter, that took more than luck. It took work, real work. The kind that left your hands red and cracked by sundown, your back sore when you tried to sleep, and your thoughts too tired to do much more than count what still needed fixing in the morning. Maeve rose early every day. She hauled dead brush away from the entrance. She cleared the drainage trench running along the hillside so rainwater would stop creeping toward the lower wall. She used Harold Mercer's ledger like both a map and a challenge, tracing every note with her finger before trying to understand it with her own hands. Heat escapes where carelessness lets it. One line read in Harold's tight, practical script. She thought about that sentence more than she expected. Not just because of the shelter, because of life. She started with the vents. The main wheel in the lower hall had been rusted stiff, but with oil from the old kit, in a full hour of stubborn effort, she got it to turn a quarter inch, then half, then all the way, grinding and protesting, like something waking from a long sleep. The sound made her smile. It was ugly. It was beautiful. It meant something still worked. Iris Bell came by every few days, never staying long, but always bringing something useful. A heavier blanket, a bar of soap, a sack of potatoes, a piece of advice that sounded simple, until Maeve realized how much truth was buried inside it. Cold weather punishes pride, Iris told her one afternoon while helping sort dented cans from a ruined crate. You don't prepare for the winter you want. You prepare for the winter that comes. Maeve nodded and kept working. Those words stayed with her too. By the middle of October, the shelter looked different. Not pretty, not warm, not yet, but steadier, more intentional. Maeve had swept and sorted every room. She turned the back storage area into a supply space, stacking salvage jars, folded cloth, candles, and the few canned goods she could afford. She patched the cracked cot with canvas she found at a yard sale and built herself a narrow sleeping corner with blankets layered over old insulation foam. She learned how to seal drafts with stripped fabric and wax. She learned how to bank heat inside a concrete room. She learned how to listen for trouble. A loose vent rattled differently than a safe one. A pipe under stress made a sharp little click before it gave. A storm had a sound in the trees long before it reached the hill. Down in Briar Glen, people had started noticing the changes. Not all of them kindly. Some just stared when Maeve came into town for supplies, her sleeves dusty, her jeans smeared with concrete powder, her arms full of salvaged hinges or weather stripping. Some looked at her with that same soft pity she had grown to hate. Others laughed more openly. Jonah Reed was the worst of them. He usually leaned near the loading dock behind his father's hardware store with 2 or 3 boys from school, hands shoved in his jacket pockets, acting like the whole world had been built for his entertainment. One chilly afternoon, as Maeve loaded a bundle of scrap wood onto a borrowed handcart, Jonah called out, "You building a house or a bunker for the end of the world?" The boys around him snorted. Maeve kept tying the rope. Jonah stepped closer, grinning in that careless, half-mean way boys sometimes do when they have not yet learned the weight of their own words. "My guess," he said, "first snow comes, that place turns into a freezer with a door." Maeve straightened slowly. Her cheeks were pink from cold. There was dust on one side of her jaw and a scrape healing across her knuckles. She looked younger when she was quiet, older when she finally spoke. "Then it's a good thing I know how to shut the door," she said. Jonah's smile faltered, only for a second, but Maeve saw it. She pulled the cart forward and kept walking. Her heart was pounding harder than she wanted it to. Not because he had embarrassed her, because part of her feared he might be right. That night, the hill felt lonelier than usual. The wind had changed. It came down off the ridge with a bitter edge now, pressing against the steel door in long, low gusts. Maeve sat cross-legged on the floor with Harold's ledger open beside a lantern, studying the old diagrams again. Ventilation, heat retention, emergency fuel use, snow load around the entrance. She read until the words blurred. Then she heard tires on gravel outside. Not just one vehicle, 2. Her whole body went still. A hard knock came against the steel door. Maeve rose at once. When she opened it, Her uncle stood there under the weak beam of a truck headlight, shoulders hunched inside his work coat, jaw already set in irritation. Behind him, Sheriff Dalton Price climbed out of the passenger side, hat low against the wind. Maeve's stomach dropped. Her uncle looked past her into the shelter like he was inspecting a mistake. "This has gone far enough," he said. "No hello, no softness. Just that." Sheriff Price did not sound cruel, but he did sound firm. "Maeve," he said, "we need to talk about whether this is safe." The wind pushed dead leaves across the concrete step. The lantern behind her threw a thin band of golden light into the dark. Maeve stood in that doorway with one hand still on the steel handle, feeling all at once how hard she had worked, and how quickly someone else might try to take it away. Far above the hill, the sky had turned the color of cold iron, and somewhere deep in the trees, the first true warning of winter moved through the branches. Maeve did not step back from the doorway. The wind pushed at her coat. The lantern light trembled against the concrete walls behind her. For one suspended second, nobody spoke. Not her uncle, not Sheriff Price, not even the trees. It was the kind of silence that comes right before something breaks or changes. Her uncle let out a tired breath through his nose. "This isn't a home," he said, glancing past her shoulder with open disapproval. "It's a hole in the ground. You've made your point. Now gather your things." Maeve felt the old ache rise in her chest. That same familiar sting. The one that came whenever someone older, louder, and more certain decided they knew what her life should be. But she was not standing in his kitchen now. She was standing in the one place she had fought for, with blistered hands and sleepless nights. Sheriff Dalton Price took one step forward, not unkind, but firm in the way men like him had learned to be. "Maeve," he said, "nobody's here to drag you out tonight, but the temperature's dropping hard. We've got an early front moving in. If this place isn't ready, and you stay here alone, that becomes a real problem." Maeve held his gaze. "It is ready," she said. The sheriff looked past her into the shelter again. At the stacked supplies, the cleared floor, the vent wheel she had restored, the sleeping corner tucked neatly against the warmer wall. He said nothing at first, and somehow that was worse. Her uncle gave a bitter little laugh. "Ready?" he said. "For what? A cold night? Maybe. A real winter? No chance." Maeve tightened her fingers around the steel handle. Then, quieter than anger, steadier than pleading, she said, "This place has already survived more winters than any of us." That landed, not loudly, but enough. Sheriff Price's eyes shifted slightly. He had heard something in her tone that did not belong to a child arguing. It belonged to somebody who had done the work. Still, before he could answer, the wind changed. A long, low gust swept over the hill and brought with it the first sharp flakes of snow. Not many, just enough to silence all three of them. Sheriff Price turned and looked toward town. Beyond the ridge, the sky had thickened into a heavy, leaden gray, the kind that settled in and did not move. He muttered something under his breath, then looked back at Maeve. "You got firewood? Some? Water?" "A small reserve, and the lower tank still holds." His brows lifted at that. "You know how to clear the intake if snow drifts over the east vent?" Maeve did not hesitate. "Yes, sir." For the first time, her uncle looked less annoyed than unsettled, like he had expected stubbornness, not competence. Sheriff Price gave one slow nod. "All right." Her uncle turned sharply. "Dalton, she knows more about this shelter than I expected," the sheriff said flatly. "And right now, I've got two elderly couples down near Miller Road refusing evacuation and a church basement generator that may or may not hold through the night. I don't have time to argue pride on a hill." The words hit Maeve's uncle harder than he wanted to show. He looked at her, then really looked at her, as if seeing, maybe for the first time, that she had built something in the space where he had expected her to fail. But he did not apologize. Men like him often didn't. He only said gruff and clipped, "If you freeze up here, don't expect miracles." Maeve swallowed. "I'm not waiting for miracles." That ended it. Her uncle climbed back into the truck. Sheriff Price lingered one moment longer and took off one glove, reaching into his coat pocket. He handed her a folded emergency weather bulletin and a small battery radio. "Storm advisory says this could turn ugly by morning," he said. "Keep the radio on low. If you hear the county issue a whiteout warning, don't open that door for anything unless you absolutely have to." Maeve accepted both with a quiet, "Thank you." He tipped his hat once, then turned and headed back toward the truck. The headlights swung wide across the hill, then disappeared down the road. And suddenly, Maeve was alone again. Only now the aloneness felt different, heavier. Real. She closed the steel door and dropped the crossbar into place. The sound echoed through the shelter like the locking of something sacred. Outside, snow began ticking against the metal vent cover in soft, dry taps. Inside, the lantern cast a warm amber circle across the floor while shadows collected in the corners. Maeve stood still for a long moment, listening. The shelter had its own language now, a faint hum in the vent shaft, a hollow creak in the upper hinge, the distant, comforting slosh of water in the lower tank. She set the radio on the workbench, unfolded the weather bulletin, and read every line twice. Temperatures dropping fast, heavy accumulation overnight, winds increasing after midnight, travel likely impossible by dawn. Her pulse kicked. This was it. Not winter in theory, not winter in Harold Mercer's notes, not winter as a warning in someone else's memory. This was the first true test. Maeve moved quickly. She checked the vent wheel, stacked extra blankets within reach, portioned food by candlelight, filled a kettle from the tank, fed kindling carefully into the old stove, and watched until the flame caught clean and steady. Then she went to the back room and opened Harold's ledger to the marked pages she had read so many times. The corners were beginning to soften. Snow load, heat retention, emergency protocol. At the bottom of one page, in that same careful old handwriting, was a line she had nearly overlooked before. When the storm comes, do not waste strength fearing it. Use your strength preparing for the person who may knock after dark. Maeve stared at those words. Outside, the wind rose higher. The shelter walls seemed to settle deeper into the hill. And somewhere beyond the thick concrete, beyond the trees, beyond the first whitening roads of Briar Glen, winter finally arrived. By midnight, the storm was no longer something happening outside. It was everywhere, in the howl pressing against the steel door, in the fine shiver running through the vent cover, in the deep, steady cold trying every crack, every seam, every inch of concrete, as if winter itself were testing whether Maeve Collins had truly earned the right to stay. Inside the shelter, the stove gave off a modest, stubborn heat. Maeve had wrapped herself in 2 blankets and was sitting at the workbench with Harold Mercer's ledger open beside the lantern when she heard it. Not the wind, not the trees, a knock. 3 hard blows against the steel door. She froze. For one heartbeat, fear moved through her fast and sharp. Then she remembered the line in Harold's ledger. Use your strength, preparing for the person who may knock after dark. Maeve grabbed the lantern and climbed the stairs. Snow had already pushed halfway up the outer frame. She lifted the crossbar, pulled the door open against the weight of the wind, and the storm came at her like a living thing. On the steps stood Evelyn Hart, snow crusted in her hair, one arm around her little boy, the other clutching her daughter close against her coat. Behind her, half stumbling through the white darkness, was Jonah Reed. His face was red with cold. One side of his jacket was torn. He looked shaken in a way Maeve had never seen before. "Maeve!" Evelyn shouted over the wind. "Our power went out. Then part of the porch roof came down. Sheriff said if we could make it to higher ground, get inside!" Maeve yelled. There was no time for anything else. She dragged the steel door wider. Jonah helped push the children down the steps. Evelyn nearly slipped, catching herself against the wall. Snow swirled into the stairwell, wild and blinding, before Maeve slammed the door shut and dropped the crossbar back into place. For a few seconds, everybody just stood there breathing hard. The children were crying. Evelyn was shaking so badly she could barely get her gloves off. Jonah leaned against the wall, trying to hide the fact that he was limping. Maeve did not waste a second. "Blankets are in the back room. Stove stays clear. Wet things off now," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Jonah, sit down before that leg gives out." "Evelyn, I need to look at the kids' hands." No one argued. Not tonight. That was the strange thing about real trouble. It stripped people down to what mattered. Maeve moved quickly, checking fingers, rubbing warmth back into small hands, heating broth, dividing out crackers, adding one careful piece of wood at a time to the stove so they would not burn through fuel too fast. Evelyn kept whispering thank you through chattering teeth. Jonah stayed quiet, watching Maeve with an expression that looked a lot like disbelief. Near dawn, the real danger came. The vent began to backdraft. Maeve noticed it first in the smell. Smoke, not heavy yet, but wrong. The stove flame flickered low and strange. The children started coughing. Snow, she realized. It had drifted over part of the outside intake just like Harold's notes had warned. If she did not clear it, the shelter would fill with smoke long before morning. Evelyn saw her face change. "What is it?" Maeve was already grabbing the wrench and flashlight. "Vents choking. You can't go out there in this." I don't need outside. I need the side crawl space. Jonah pushed himself up too fast and winced. I'll go. Maeve looked at his leg, then shook her head. You won't fit, and you know it. The crawl space was narrow, cold, and lined with old metal braces that scraped skin if you moved wrong. Maeve had cleared part of it weeks ago, never imagining she would be crawling through it in the middle of a blizzard with 3 other lives depending on how fast she worked. She dropped to her knees and pulled herself into the dark. Concrete pressed close around her. Her flashlight beam shook across the vent shaft, catching bolts, old mesh, packed ice. Behind her, muffled now, she could hear the shelter. The soft cry of a child. Evelyn trying to soothe them. The wind pounding the hill like a giant fist. Maeve wedged the wrench into the ice latch and pulled. Nothing. She tried again, harder this time, feeling the metal bite into her scraped palm. Still nothing? Her fear rose hot and ugly in her throat. Not fear for herself, fear of failing now. After all that work, after all those lonely mornings and aching hands and nights spent believing this place could hold. Come on, she whispered, more prayer than command. Then she braced both boots, pulled with everything she had, and the latch broke free. A rush of air tore through the shaft. The stove in the main room caught clean again. The smoke changed direction. Maeve closed her eyes for just 1 second, breathing hard in the freezing dark. When she crawled back into the shelter, dusty, shaking, and white with frost, nobody said a word at first. Evelyn just looked at her, with tears standing in her eyes. Jonah stared like he was seeing someone entirely different from the girl he used to laugh at outside the hardware store. By morning, the storm had buried half the hill, but inside the shelter, they were warm enough, alive. And when rescue trucks finally made it up the road the following afternoon, Sheriff Price stood in the doorway, took one look around at the blankets, the soup pot, the children asleep against Evelyn's side, and then at Maeve, and he removed his hat without saying a thing. Some kinds of respect do not need words. By the time the roads opened and the town started talking, the story had already spread. The old shelter on the hill, the 16-year-old girl. The night winter came hard, and the place everyone pitied became the safest place in Briar Glen. In the weeks that followed, people showed up with things they should have offered earlier. Firewood, canned food, a proper cot, fresh weather stripping, even paint for the rusted steel door. Jonah came too, carrying a toolbox and a look on his face that was equal parts shame and sincerity. I was wrong, he said simply. Maeve nodded once. That was enough, because by then she understood something bigger than apology. A place does not become valuable because people finally notice it. It becomes valuable because when the worst night comes, it holds. And so do the people inside it. Now I want to ask you something. Have you ever been underestimated, overlooked, or treated like you would never amount to anything, only to discover that your hardest season was the very thing that revealed your strength? If this story touched your heart, let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and what part of Maeve's journey stayed with you the most. And if you believe quiet courage still matters in this world, subscribe to the channel and join us for more stories about resilience, hope, and ordinary people who rise when life turns cold.